and
There you go.
it's pretty interesting.
I have a concert on Saturday evening, Memphis Women's Chorale.
I can't be there.
Matthew is a jerk, and just kidding. After he told me
It's on the podcast, by the way. I will keep that on the podcast.
No, it's at 7 at Lindenwood Christian, and it's a movie theme.
Oh, that's
it's gonna be awesome, especially because Lindenwood, like, it's the sound, like the live, it's gonna sound really awesome in there. So, yeah, 7 o'clock. Tickets are $10 at the door, $8 online.
Dang.
Yeah.
There you go. Saturday night.
Saturday night.
Be there.
Be there or be a jerk.
Or be at Cedar Hill Farms.
I'll be a jerk too, so don't worry.
Yeah, and I will definitely be a jerk.
Fine, you're all jerks.
So I took it upon myself to pick a question for us to talk about tonight. Since we had the rock band in last week.
Wasn't that awesome?
It was very good.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, they're always really good. Good people too.
Oh yeah.
So tonight we're going to discuss how are we to reconcile the tragedies that happen, or why do they happen, and what's the meaning behind them, or is there a meaning behind them? So I took some liberties and added. That was your question. Took some liberties and added some stuff. So to boil it down into a question, to make sense of tragedies and is there meaning in them? So it's kind of a two-part question. And so we'll do what we normally do. We'll go around the room, give our initial impressions, and then we'll get into some other stuff. So I'm going to let Jana kick that off.
Okay.
And we'll come around.
Can you repeat the question just one more time?
Yeah. Let's see. How are we to reconcile the tragedies that happen, or why do tragedies happen, and then is there any meaning behind them?
Okay. I think tragedies, I don't think we always know the why. I don't think necessarily I don't think that they are caused by God or anything like that. I think a lot of it has to do is we all have free will, and somebody else's free will can affect my life, and that kind of thing. So I don't really know a whole lot to say about that, but I think that we are completely able to learn from tragedies, and good things happen out of them. I'm one of those things. My mom lost her first husband when she was 22 years old. He died very suddenly of a heart condition that they didn't know he had. And when my brother was 4. But she met my dad and had me and my sister, and so even though she has tragedy in her life would, not my brother. If that had not have happened, my brother would not be. He would not be the person he is today. He would not be an ordained minister. Like my dad's the one who got my mom and him in a church family and that kind of thing. So I definitely think that we can take things from tragedy and use them for good, and that good things can happen out of them, even though we may not see it until years down the road.
I don't think everything happens for a reason. I don't believe in predestination. I don't think God's going to be like, oh, well, on February 5th, you're going to get in a car wreck and it's going to change your life. I think that good things can come out of a tragedy. I think you can rely on God and people around you and learn things from that. But I don't think there's always a reason why. I don't think we're meant to understand everything. I think God can give you peace in a situation, but I don't think you may ultimately never fully understand why something happens.
Basically the same things that Carly and Jane have said. I don't think that there is a reason. I don't think there's a reason behind everything, good or bad. Sometimes, and then sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't, and sometimes there are things. I feel like you can learn something from every situation, but you're not necessarily going to. That kind of puts. It's on you sometimes to learn. It's not going to be like, and here's the lesson you learned from this. And yeah.
Well, first of all, I think tragedies suck, and I think that it's unfortunate that they happen when they do. I am under the impression that good things can come out of tragedies, and like y'all have all said, we don't always know what that is, and we don't know when it's going to happen. We really don't know until after it's occurred, and we can look back and we can say, oh, well, that makes sense. But I think we can also get trapped in our tragedy. I've had a lot of tragedy in my life. You know, up to now, I've had, you know, an aunt to go missing and she's never been found. I've had an uncle to commit suicide, another uncle to, you know, pass away and not be found for a week, and and friends to commit suicide, and it's just, it sucks. I don't know. Sometimes I ride the fence about, you know, no, I don't believe things happen for a reason, and yes, I do believe things happen for a reason. It's kind of a pendulum for me, back and forth as far as that goes, just based on where I am, you know, in tragedy. But it is, I've seen people get lost in tragedy and never be able to recover. You know, it's almost a tragedy in itself. It's kind of crazy to think about that. It's like a never-ending cycle of tragedy that happens, and but yeah, I don't know why it happens. I mean, I'm sure that, you know, everything is always revealed to us later on, or maybe, you know, not in this life, just in another life. But it's kind of where I am.
Okay. Leslie, you got any thoughts on this?
Sure. I guess one thing that pops in my mind first is like the question, like what really makes something a tragedy? And I guess I could just assume that it's something that changes the person. Because I mean, like this morning, I woke up late for school. I was in a tragedy kind of in itself, because I was like, oh, I got to get to school. But I think about, I guess we're more talking about like more larger, very dramatic tragedies. And again, what potentially could change a person's life. And I guess to reconcile with the tragedy, the first thing that comes to my mind is I watched a movie about a month ago called Lars and the Real Girl. And it's about this guy who gets a prosthetic doll, and he like treats her like she's a real person. So I recommend watching the movie because I don't want to spoil it for everyone. But a tragedy happens in there, and there's a line that a woman says, and it's during a funeral scene, and there's these just older women sitting inside of a house with this person, and the person's like, y'all can just go on, I don't need you to be here. And the women say, no, you've just had something really dramatic happen in your life, and what people do is we sit in your house with you. So being with people during tragedies, I think is very important. Just being there. I don't think we have to ultimately understand what they're going through, or unless we have been through that itself. But to me personally, I just want to be there for that person in whatever way that I can, even if it's just listening to them. Understanding tragedies and how we should view them. Again, a lot of you said that we don't know the why to it, and so I'll repeat that. I agree with that very much so. We don't have to understand everything. But again, I think just being there for one another, to me, is what's important.
I would be inclined to say that we can in some way understand why things take place. But if by meaning you're saying that these are teachable moments that God orchestrated, then I would disagree that there's no meaning. If you mean that we learn something from them, then I would agree with you. So it just depends on what you mean by that. And then when it comes to, I don't know, just making sense of it and trying to understand it more, I feel like I can only go off stuff that I've experienced, and through what I've experienced, I don't think God is the one who orchestrated those things and made those things happen. And I don't think God is, like Carly said, using those as teachable moments to be like, well, the only way Nathan could learn this is by doing this. I don't think that that's how that added up. I feel like God is in the midst of those things. He's with the people who are suffering and mourning. And I feel like that's where God's place is, to help us through it, not cause it and then help us through it. That seems counterproductive. Why not just not do it? So I don't feel like those are what it is, but I think God can use those moments to teach us, but I don't think God needs to teach us through tragedy. I feel like if God's orchestrating that, then something's wrong with God, because God could teach us whatever God wanted to, and He doesn't have to use those things to do it, I feel like. So, but I do think God speaks in those moments, and God's with us in those moments, and then somehow we can understand that through going through it. So I guess what I wanted to do is to go through a couple of things as we think through understanding tragedies and whether or not there's meaning behind them, and what can we pull from them in some way. And so I looked up this article, and back when, you all remember the guy who was at, I think it was the Dark Knight. It could be the Dark Knight Rises. Okay. And he went in and locked the doors in the movie theater and started killing people in Aurora. Right after that, there was an article on the Denver Post of one of the journalists started proposing the question to people in and around the Denver area, not in Aurora, but in and around, where was God in that? How do you think of God when you think of this moment, like in Aurora? And so he took all those reactions that he was getting from people and kind of broke them down into 7 categories of what they look like. Wesley, if you want to look at the article, if you put the little yellow, look like price tags on the side,
yeah,
it should pop up those articles. Did that pop up for you?
Yes, it did.
There you go. It's the one, I forget what it is. It's like Greg Boyd or something like that.
Is it cross-centered evaluation of responses to tragedy?
That's it. Cross-centered approaches to tragedy. So I didn't want to go through each of those, but basically his point is he tries to view everything through the cross and tries to view tragedy through that, because that is one of the most tragic things that ever happened. God was crucified. So he says he tries to see things through that. So anyway, he took these 7 responses and looked through them through that, but I just want to talk about the 7 responses. So the first group of answers that the journalist got was that there is no God. And so that's how people make sense of where God was, because there is no God, so God wasn't there. God's never there, so it doesn't matter. The second group was don't blame God, blame Satan. And so he goes into what that looks like. But anyway, that was the second group of responses. The third group said don't blame God, blame us, or free will. The fourth group said God was behind the massacre and it was just. So there was that response from people who, come from a different way of viewing God. Like anything God chooses to do, because God orchestrates everything, there's a reason behind everything. God does it, everything. And it's just no matter what it is. So if God's doing it, it's just. So that was kind of their thought. Fifth group was God was present at the massacre, but God was with the victims, not the perpetrator. So God was present, but God was the one that was being victimized, not with the person who was killing everybody. The sixth group was which God? Because they were asking the question, do you mean like a personal, like metaphysical God? Because we don't think that exists. But if you mean like kind of a higher power that we all rally around in some way that affects our lives, then that's different. But we don't believe in like that higher power, more of like higher power collective within the community of people, blah, blah, blah. And then the seventh group said, who knows, it's a mystery. So those were kind of the 7 responses to where God was in the midst of that tragedy. And so I thought it might be interesting to just take a moment using these 7 responses and try to think about where do we see God in that? Like in a tragedy, something major, something that has some sort of effect on us. Where do we see God in that? Does it cause us to have the first answer, which is there is no God? Does it causing us that we shouldn't blame God, we should blame evil or Satan or the devil or whatever you want to call that? Do we want to don't blame God, blame us? It's our fault that these things take place and free will. Do we say that God was behind it, that it was just because God's the orchestrator of all things? Is it that God was present but with the victims, not with the perpetrator? Was it which God? Because I don't necessarily believe in that higher power kind of God, though I do believe in something. Or in the 7th group, who knows, it's a mystery. I don't know where God is in the midst of those things. So where would you find yourself when it comes to that?
I think for me, I think there's 2 of them. I think the free will one, but also with the victims, because whenever you pose that question first, where was God in that tragedy, my mind immediately went to the stories I heard of a couple of nurses that happened to be in the theater, and they were able to save some people's lives. And so my mind immediately went to that, and God is in the healers that happened to be there at the time. But
I would tend to agree with you on that aspect of it, but I would find myself between that and who knows.
Yeah.
I'm like, God was there, but we have free will, and then the who knows, we're not going to explain it. It's kind of like a combo of those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I run the gambit through all of those in some form or fashion. I would tend to say that I view it as God is present with the victims. I don't see it as a mystery necessarily, because I think that when you have mentally unstable people with access of any kind of gun that they want to get, things are going to happen sometimes. So, I mean, as much as I want to explain it in a different way, I just feel like that's, it makes total sense to me. Like, unfortunately, that is a part of it. But when I start to think about those responses, I think the first thing that comes to my mind as a person who thinks critically about my relationship with God and about God in general is that there is this question of, if God is good, God is all loving, and God is all powerful, and God can do all things, then if God is present, why the hell didn't he just stop it to begin with? I know that God was present with the victims. Well, why couldn't he have just been present with the perpetrator and stopped that perpetrator from doing that thing, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it? Then there would be no victims. for God to be present with. And I think that that's kind of the question that kind of springs up in this. And I think that that's the reason why we asked that question about, why do tragedies happen? What's the meaning behind them? Because we have this view of God in some way, and how we view God is going to extrapolate itself into different circumstances. When things don't happen, when things are good, we can see God in all types of ways. Like, however we picture God is going to make sense. But when bad things happen, it kind of jumbles up our belief system. It kind of shakes us a little bit and tries to mess with us a little bit. Like that question, like, okay, well, if God is all loving and all powerful and merciful and kind, then, and God can be present anywhere at all times, then what was he doing? Why was he just with the victims? Why not just stop it and not be present? So I feel like that's really the question this begs to me is, where I understand we can say nice things like, where's God? Well, he's with the victims, and that's great and that's positive, but why is there victims to begin with? That's really what we're asking. That's really what we're talking about.
Let's see, there was some religious philosopher that I had to read in a philosophy of religion class.
Makes sense that you would read philosophy.
Yes. I don't remember who it was. It was somebody like I had heard of before, of people like sermons and stuff talking about them. But it was, if we always talk about God being omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, and so he knows all, he can do anything, and he's always present. But then when you break stuff down, when we try and think about it, he can only be two of those things. Either he knows all and can't do anything about it, and so but he's still there, or he doesn't know what's coming, and so but he can do what he can and when he's there, and then or whatever the other third one is. And it was always read it, and it was an online class, so everybody was writing their responses to.
He's all powerful, but he chooses not to do anything.
Yeah, and it was just, and then it was like, but then if we talk about God being kind, then why would he choose to let people like suffer, die, things blow up, things happen, like, so it was always I just remember being really interested in people's responses to that, and how, because it was a whole bunch of people, it wasn't just like a bunch of Christians talking, it was people who were not Christian and not religious at all, and so it was really interesting reading all that stuff. But and I find myself thinking about it all the time. It's just been on my mind recently about how when things are going great and don't seem to make sense, like when you sit and think about it, it's like, wow, that doesn't really, like, my day was really good. All these great things happened and I didn't really do anything to make them happen. Oh, great, thanks, God. But then when something bad happens, whether it's one thing or a whole bunch of things, and you sit down and try and think about it and be like, but that's when all the why questions start to come up, and it doesn't make sense. And it really, as someone of my mindset, it just really, really frustrates me when I can't pin it down, and I don't know why, and I can't ask why, or people's answers about why don't make sense to me, and it just gets really very frustrating.
In the same way, I'd rather have a reason and understand exactly why something bad is happening, as opposed to I don't have any closure. I don't have a reason for why this has happened. That's when things bother me.
You always find that, and like you were saying, it's always just when things aren't good is when we find ourselves questioning. We never question when things are good, or at least I don't.
Yeah, and I think that's when we heard that one response where it said God was the orchestrator of it, and everything God does is just. I think that's where it makes sense to a lot of people, is because you can attribute everything back to that.
Yeah.
So there is no question of why, because God's just and God did it. So you don't have to be like, well, God's the good God who does all the good things for me, but all the bad things come from elsewhere, and I don't know where that elsewhere is. I can't figure it out, but I know good comes from God, and everything else I don't know. This way, God's just. Whatever happens, God orchestrated it, planned it, made it happen, and in some way there is good in it. Somewhere there is justness in it, and it's good, and it's just because God was a part of that. I'm not saying that eases your mind about stuff, as if your picture of God is not like that, then that's not going to help you. But I know that that's why lots of people gravitate towards that, and that's why we say things like at people's funerals, it was God's will, or blah blah blah. You know, we say that because we want that to be the truth. We want somehow to be able to say that we know without a doubt, and somewhere, somehow, God is a part of this in some way. And I think that that's the difficult part about tragedies and stuff like that, is that it pricks at the things that we think we think.
Yeah.
Like, we have this idea of what God is and how God works, and then there's always something that comes in and just kind of tweaks it a little bit and changes your thought, unless you just suppress it. It's like, oh, unless you just push it away. Any other thoughts on that?
I feel like it bothers us because we don't know how to be with each other sometimes in tragedy. And like you were saying, like when people say, oh, it's all God's plan, I feel like a lot of times if we're the person saying it, we mean it to be comforting, and either it's not comforting because the tragedy, and I think in some ways, closeness to the tragedy is part of it. So like with Aurora, we're over here in Memphis, and there's some distance there, so it's like, okay, maybe like God's plan, okay, it's somewhat comforting. But then if it was your husband, wife, sister, mother, brother, whatever, that was one of the victims, then you're like, this doesn't, and you're that close to it, it really completely doesn't make sense to you why this person who was such a great person does all this stuff that you know of personally just was killed.
Sure.
So, and I think that that's something that like we as people sometimes struggle with because we don't know what to say, and we want to say something to be helpful and be comforting and be that like wholesome presence in somebody's life that's going through a tragedy.
Yeah. I think, like Wesley said earlier in his first little thought, is sometimes the best thing to do is just be present.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And words aren't going to cut it lots of times, and we just need to be present with each other and not feel like we have to stumble to find the words to.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's easier said than done because we've all probably said things that we meant to be comforting or to be kind, and they weren't necessarily the most comforting and kind thing in the world.
I was about to say, a lot of times those things people do end up presenting. And another thing, it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to be angry. Like, in our society, it's like, oh, you'll be okay. Deal with it.
You got to get over it as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's okay to be sad. Just
you got to
accept that.
Everybody's got their own time frame of when people should be over something.
Mm-hmm.
As if like they get to decide for you when you get to get over stuff. Like,
I think we have it for ourselves too. Sure. Sometimes. And
it's been a week.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me?
Yeah. With me, I think sometimes it takes me days it takes me time to process it, and so I might not show any major emotion. I had a few years ago, I waited tables for a couple of years, and I had one of the guys that I worked with, he was one of my managers, and after, I think it was probably a year after I'd left, at least a year, he was murdered by a crazy person that had come down from Philadelphia to Franklin. I don't know all the situation, but I just remember I was in shock for the first few days, and it took me a good few days before I just broke down and was able to process it. So yeah, I think that's part of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the timeline has to do with the the timing of the closure of the situation too. You know, with all tragedies, I mean, it's always a sad situation. I mean, and we're talking about tragedy in like the big dramatic sense of the word tragedy. I think that's what we're talking about. But like tragedy that has no closure at all. Like my mom's sister, this week is the 25th anniversary of her
Whatever.
yeah, whatever. What nobody knows because she's never been found, and my mom went absolutely crazy when it happened, and like she didn't talk about it for about 15 years. She just refused to talk about it at all. Because I mean, it's like everybody's giving these, you know, empty condolences, you know, of like, oh, you know, it's okay. She's like, no, it's not okay.
And like I'm sure back then it was like, I'm sure she'll turn up. Don't
Oh
worry.
gosh, yeah.
Like
And so
how long does that excuse last?
right. So I mean, I think a lot of the timeline thing has a lot to do with the timing of closure that we have with the situation. But she'll talk about it now. She doesn't like to, but she will.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that there's an easy answer to this. I don't think it's something that we can figure out in an hour, but I do think that, and I've tried to help people see this, is that we have to think through these things on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the midst of what we're going through, like if something tragic takes place, it's hard to figure those things out. But if you have some sort of idea of what you really think about that, not like a second grade answer, but like a really an adult answer to that you can live with, it makes it easier to process. It makes it, you're more free to just be and grieve and not have those questions on your mind, and not to be wrapped up in some sort of guilt or shame or anger that you might feel based on the things that you hadn't worked out on the front end. I always revert back to Jesus talking about it's not the sick that need the doctor, you know,
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
we need to, you know, I think most of the time, me included, I go see a doctor when I'm sick. And I gotta be real sick, not like, oh, I just feel bad. Like I gotta be sick.
3 days.
There we go. Black lung, here it comes. You gotta be like, you know, I gotta be really sick. But when it comes to thinking about things on the front end, like if I was more proactive in my health and taking care of myself on that front end, the times that I was really sick would be a lot less. And I think the same goes with our relationship with God. Things would be thrown less in flux if we were working on those ideas and what we think on the front end as opposed to in the midst of those things. And it's easier said than done because most of the time when we think about that stuff is when something bad happens. And it's not very uplifting and heartwarming to sit around and think about tragedy and terrible things taking place and things that have taken place in our lives, and try to process that. Most of the time we don't want to think about those things until they happen, and lots of people don't want to think about them at all, and they just push them away and don't reflect on them at all, and they wonder why they're sick or tired or angry all the time. Well, it's because you didn't process, you didn't grieve, you didn't do what you need to do as a human being to get through things. Not get over it, because some things you just don't get over. They're always there. They're a piece of you, but you can get through them in some way.
Like you said, like a doctor, you know, it's okay to go get an antibiotic. That's normal. That's accepted with society, but you're not going to be like, oh, I'm going to a therapist, I'm having trouble. You know, it's just like that, and talking to people, you know, like if I walk in, I'm like, hey, I have the flu, no one's gonna say anything. But if you walk in and say, "Hey, I'm struggling with this," there's still that taboo.
Sure.
It's tragic, but it's the truth.
Because I think a little bit of it is because it's all too real. The flu, whatever, like, unless you're just a germaphobe, it's not going to have any effect on you unless you have it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if Hannah's got the flu, well, first off, you should be here, but if Hannah's got the flu, it's not going to affect me at all. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, she's got the flu. But if I get it, then it does affect me. But when someone talks about struggling or having doubts or going through a breakup or, you know what I'm saying? Somebody died in their family, something unexpected took place, that's all too real because we all have those experiences on a daily basis. It's not like they just happen to us once and it goes away. Like, all of those things build up in us. Like, every breakup, every fight, every, misstep, or you said something you didn't want to, like, that doesn't go away just in that moment. Like, it stays with us. And so I feel like the reason why that is and why we're not able to talk about those things very well is because we haven't processed our own stuff. We haven't gotten through what we need to get through, and it's all too real, and it brings things up, it stirs it back up that we don't want. We don't want to think about those things.
Mm-hmm.
Personally. Could be wrong. I doubt it, though. Pretty right most of the time. Second thing I wanted to talk about, those of you who are sitting here in this room with me, if you have a cell phone, one of those phones, you can look up this. I would Google it. And what you're going to be Googling is meaning in pain, and then put Jesus Creed. So meaning in pain, Jesus Creed. And there should be the first thing that pops up, an article.
I can't spell.
It's okay, I misspelled meaning about 3 times. I was like, what?
From the Shepherd's Nook.
Sure, I don't know.
By John Fry.
Pathos.com.
Yeah, Patheos. That's what you're looking
I
for.
can't talk either.
I think it's right. I think it's either or. I just heard it Patheos, but I think Pathos works.
Pathos is a word.
Okay,
I don't know
thank
if
you.
it's the same word.
Yeah,
They're spelled differently.
Well, I could be saying it wrong, Carly.
Well, no, but pathos is a word.
Yeah, and it is spelled differently.
Oh,
Yes, without the E. Because that's with like
Yeah.
hubris and all that crap.
That's what I was thinking.
Greek literature
Where's Mo when you need him?
Mhm.
So everybody find that article?
with the picture of the desk.
Yes. It should be like meaning in pain proves there's a God by Jeff Cook. Should be
Oh.
the
Oh, that was
title
the
of
second
it.
That was the second.
That should be the title.
No,
of the
this
article.
is from the Shepherd's Nook, Jesus in Pain.
Not that one.
Not
The second
that one.
But that one might be good to read.
Standing in front of the ocean. Ocean.
The ocean.
Today we hit what I see as the second best.
You wish you were at Bible study right now. That's what you wish.
Well, I am here.
Um,
So we're not wishing.
All right, everybody got that?
Yes.
All right, we're going to go to the paragraph that starts, many have argued. So it should
Right
be
under
just a
that.
little bit down.
Mine has not moved.
Wait for Carly's hers to load.
Testing Emma's bandwidth over here.
She's probably not connected to my Wi-Fi.
I'm not either, actually.
Wes, you good to go?
Oh yeah, man, I'm good.
Oh, yeah. All right. Told you you won't get him for anything off it.
Hmm?
I should have got going the links earlier. Okay. My bad.
It's all good.
Preload.
I gotta edit all this out tomorrow.
So,
Jada, just so you know, since we have some time, statistically speaking, one of your spiritual discipline podcasts is the highest listened to.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Fancy.
I don't know which one it is, but I think it's the same.
That's exciting.
Yeah. It's like up to
in the
like,
whole world.
well, in our podcast history.
In our podcast world.
Yeah.
Podcast would.
Okay. Here we go.
All right. So many have argued that the suffering in our world gives us a good reason to reject God belief. For certainly a good God would act decisively to end sex slavery. A good God would destroy malaria. A good God would not remain silent in the face of war, disease, the death of children, and the other tragedies that many experience each day. But there are other arguments that arise out of pain and suffering in our world. When we assume that there is no God, the value and meaning of suffering in our world is fairly clear. As many have pointed out, in a universe of blind physical forces, some people will get hurt, other people will get lucky, and we won't find any rhyme or reason in any of it. If God does not exist, the vast majority of horrific suffering fails to lead to any identifiable good. Most tragedies kill the victim before the victim can discover any meaning in their pain. As such, when a young girl dies of bone cancer, when a region is drowned by a tsunami, when a man detonates a bomb laced with nails and ball bearings in a crowded area, these catastrophes have no resolution or value for the deceased. If there is no God, such victims couldn't experience their pains being made right again, couldn't work through the tragedy to find value. Such evils were just brute facts to swallow at grave sites. Conversely, if God is real, suffering and death might be doors leading to new lands. They could be transformed in God's future into meaningful experiences. For no matter what happened to the body of someone suffering, her soul might grow, her mind might progress, her future self that God was presently fashioning might alter into something far more substantial. We might outline such an argument this way. Part 1. Horrendous pains resulting in the death of a human being occur daily in our world. Part 2. If materialism is true, horrendous pains resulting in death hold no meaning for the sufferer. Part 3. Without meaning for the deceased sufferer, horrendous pains resulting in death are irredeemably tragic. Part 4. If materialism is true, our world experiences daily events that are irredeemably tragic. Part 5. Our world does not contain events that are irredeemably tragic, denying the repugnant conclusion. Conclusion 1. Materialism is false. Part 6. In order for there to be meaning in horrendous pains resulting in death in our world, there must be a mind of immense power that can create states of affairs in which pain of the quality and quantity we experience are transformed into the good. Part 5 and 6. A mind of immense power that can create states of affairs in which the horrendous pains resulting in death in our world are transformed into good exists, and this being we call God. What does pain tell us about our world? This may be the primary question for a world like ours. When I look at desperately sad event through the perspective of God belief and of materialism, only one holds out the potential for real hope. The other is irredeemably tragic. Suffering gives me a substantial reason to embrace God belief, for a God alone could take a world that is clearly growing and transform those spots into something alive. But if there is no God, most of the pain experienced by those I love, by most of humanity, in fact, is plainly pointless. As philosopher Peter Kreeft notes, if God is absent, then our lives with all the spots of light in them are surrounded by darkness. But if God is real, then our lives with all the spots of darkness in them are surrounded by light. So, any thoughts on this?
It's a lot of layers.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's one reason that I sometimes struggle with if there is meaning behind stuff, is like he was talking about, whatever the tragedy is, if it ends in death, there's not really any meaning for the person who died. And if, like, so that's kind of where I sometimes get into the, well, if that, like, if they, especially if it's like, if people are saying that it is a punishment for something, then, like, cosmically, if they were doing X, Y, and Z wrong, so God punished them, but they died, so I don't know if they don't get the chance in some ways to learn, and they don't get the chance to reform their habits or whatever they were doing that was wrong. And then all that's left is for us to do something about it, and sometimes I don't think that that's fair, which is always a fun question about life, whether it's fair or not, or if it is fair, why is it not fair to me? So all that kind of stuff. I just think that that's something that we hadn't talked about, was what meaning exists for the people who, especially when tragedy ends in death, what happened for them. So
I don't think there is specific meaning during the tragedy, that you might find meaning afterward, but that's not the reason the tragedy took place to begin with.
Yeah, I think the reason why we call it tragic for a tragedy is because it makes no sense. It's senseless. It wouldn't be tragic if it was, completely understood. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's senseless in some ways, and that's why we would say it's tragic. Like Sandy Hook, for instance, made no sense. Why would anybody do that? I think for him, what he was trying to say philosophically is, it is just, there is no meaning and there is no hope in either the victim or the people who are living in the aftermath of that, if there is no God. Like, that's kind of his philosophical saying, is God makes sense more in pain because it gives us hope in some reason. Not just hope for ourselves to make it through it, to move beyond tragedy, but also hope for those who are victimized here and now. That in some way there is something redeemable and hopeful about something tragic because God exists, and that hope can extend beyond this life. And if there is no God, then there is no hope for either the victims of the senseless tragedies that take place, or for us to make it through it, because it's all going to end up in a wash anyway. We're going to end up dead too. So there is no hope. There is no, good in that. Which sounds good in theory to us who believe in God, but I doubt that. I don't know what it. I can only postulate what someone who doesn't have a belief in God would say about that. Like, do they really walk around thinking that all things are hopeless and there is no
some people find
good? I don't think so.
Some people find comfort in knowing that, or in their believing that there's no rhyme or reason. I feel like it can go either way. That some people find hope in the fact that they believe there's no rhyme or reason to anything, that there's no God. Like, whatever happens, it's either their own fault, or like there's a direct correlation between what led up to an event and a tragedy or whatever. But then some people find that utterly depressing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if there's, like, I don't think you can directly correlate it to somebody's intelligence or background. I think that's one thing that each person kind of, in this crazy world we live in, comes to some either end of the spectrum or somewhere along the middle of it in their own life.
And sometimes it's not, even if they're religious or not, there's religious people that's like, God, has a hand in everything, and then there's people who are like, well, God's present, but he doesn't. So I think it's just, we're all different, and we all see the world in different ways. And
So his whole hypothesis, I think, in just in that article, is that the reason why he knows that there is a God is because he can find meaning in, like, he sees God because of tragedy, not the absence of God, but the presence of God in the midst of that. And I think that that is generally the complete opposite of how most people react to things when they take place, is that God is beyond us, elsewhere, a mystery, not present, distant when those things take place, as opposed to God makes more sense, is more real, is closer when bad things happen. Would that be your experience?
Depends on what you ask me.
Well, I'm asking you. But yeah, and I think that's the thing, talking about on the front end, thinking things through. So when you get in the midst of that, when things do take place, you have something to hang on to, something to hold on to in those times.
I feel like since I have thought, because I think our immortality, but all of us have thought about that to some extent, and whether or not it's developed past a second grade answer is for me always up to debate. But it depends on what the tragedy is, and that's why it depends on when you ask me, is if it's after I failed a test, or is it after I found out my grandfather died? And it all depends. Or is it like after Sandy Hook, or is it after 9/11? It all depends on when you ask, and like what the tragedy is, and like I was talking about earlier, how far or close it is, I think sometimes has a big influence on me and how I think about things, whether or not I've thought on the front end about all of that.
Any other thoughts? All right. So next week I will be gone. So if you go to the concert, have fun. If you come here, then do what we've been doing over the past couple of weeks. Try to find some scriptures that speak about tragedy or speak about meaning within it, and discuss those in a formal setting called Bible study, where you actually study
So formal.
the Bible.
What?
But it will work a lot better if those of you that are here and have scriptures. It makes the conversation go a little bit better. Anything we need to be praying about this week? Think about it.
Safe travels, and I praise that my cousin's getting married on Saturday,
That's
and
awesome.
that I get to see my family and everything.
You're going to North Kakalaki?
No, I'm going to DC.
Oh, okay.
And get to see some of my really good friends while I'm up there too.
Nice.
So I'm pumped.
Say hi to Brock.
If I see him,
We're on a first name basis. Just say Nathan said, hey, Brock.
I'll run into the White House without going through security.
I feel like we're on a first name basis.
And then you'll see me on the news.
I mean,
and I'll
you
wait.
could
You send me 9 emails a day.
Not get caught.
Yeah. Show up at the Oval, knock on the door, and be like, "What's up, dude?"
You can't just walk up there. I saw on the news that dude
That's what I'm
just walked
saying.
Yeah, dude.
Forget a tour, he just busted right up in there.
Wave to Michelle.
Was he in the elevator with the president or something?
That was another time.
Oh, okay.
That was another guy
I
who
missed
had
that
like
one.
felonies on his background.
Ah.
He was just riding the elevator without whatever.
I thought the last guy like ran in the front door and like
That guy,
tackled
yeah.
him or something.
Yeah, that probably wasn't smart.
I want to get ice cream with Joe. Is what I want to do.
Oh, yeah.
The
Have a big
picture
slice of
makes me
pizza
laugh.
for me in DC. And what's that famous hot dog place that's there? Ben's Chili.
Oh yeah, that's
You know?
where they hang out.
Good stuff.
I'll be there.
Anybody else?
My mom, I only told a few people, she was rushed to the hospital Wednesday morning. She was alert, but very disoriented, and could not tell that the light was on. The EMTs, her blood pressure was so low that they couldn't find a pulse. And so she was in the hospital for a few days. She was in ICU, and then they moved her Friday to a regular room, and she went home Saturday. So she's better, but it took them 3 or 4 days to get her blood pressure up. And they're still not sure what has caused it. And so my mother is a medical anomaly, and this is not uncommon that they can't figure it out. So just prayers that they figure out what's going on, because she's gone through a lot of medical stuff, especially recently. So.
Wes, anything we should pray about for you, man?
Everything's doing pretty well for me right now. I really don't have anything going much on in my life except for school and band. And on the other hand is getting ready to do some church youth things like retreats and whatnot. I think she's a little nervous about it. So I just want to make sure that she gets peace out of all of it and support, most importantly, from the church. But everything else is good.
Is she doing retreats and stuff like that with the conference, or just her church in McKenzie?
I guess Lakeshore. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So she'll be there with like 200 other people.
Yeah. She's not really worried. Yeah, not really worried about it, but just more of oh my gosh, this is my first retreat. With her, this is the first time being in the denomination. I think this is kind of a little bit, kind of anxious, I guess. So.
Yeah, I understand that. I took a couple of kids to Lakeshore for a 30-hour famine, and I didn't know anybody. And, that was at the time where the youth didn't really want to hang out with their youth director. So I was kind of I'm an introvert anyway, so I'm just kind of like hanging out by myself most of the retreat, which is good. I needed it, so it was fine. And it went well. But Anna's a little more outgoing than Nathan, so.
Maybe.
Yeah, she'll be good. She'll like Lakeshore. It's
yeah,
a cool
Lakeshore's
place.
awesome.
It's a cool place. Right. Anything else? All right. Barton's not here, so I'm going to pray for us. Okay. God, we thank you so much that we can come together, and we pray, God, that you help us find you in the good and the bad, that we know that you're present with us. Help us to ever so slightly understand what that looks like, so we can find you in the midst of tragedy. God, we pray that other people who are in the midst of tragedies can find you as well, find peace and comfort and love there through you and through others. We pray, God, for all the requests that were said and unsaid, and we lift them up to you, and help us to think about those this week and to continue to support one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, man. You and Dre Beats, have a good evening.
All right, we're gonna lay down that beat. Thanks, guys.
See you.
Bye, Wesley.
Bye,
Bye, Wesley.
Bye.